So I'll introduce Professor Bernstein from Santa Barbara. The last time she was at Georgetown campus, if memory serves me correctly, was the summer of 2000, when Matt Holt and I upstairs on the 6th floor held our little summer seminar on how to turn your dissertation into a book. And she turned her dissertation into an excellent book, Between Crown and Community, which is about Poitiers. A number of you have read it, I know. And she's working on a new book. And you've all seen the chapter she sent around to us on Learning Histories in the French Revolution of Religion. And I might say this was, oh, wow, let me see. I can't remember this. All right, so, yes. While I'm thinking that Philippe Armand is organizing a conference in Rennes in September on Bertrand Garfunkel, right? And so he already asked me to give a paper because we knew I was working on other provisions. And so one of the people we can talk about is these. But and the other one is the Century of the Barra, which I'm going to talk about it in considerable length. And look at them in conjunction with that. And I think it would be fascinating about what you're doing. It's not the best of the time.
Yeah, and actually already
Yeah, I know, I'm doing really hard.
well, for me, it's
Yeah. Yeah, they're good. It's 26th to the 28th. No, but she wanted to read the whole thing.
What?
Your book from this.
Have we talked about this?
No, we were just talking about it.
Yeah, we were talking.
You wanted to read Cosendi's book on Le Monde. Your topic.
Sure, yes. I love
Yeah, and so I'll send me an email like Wednesday morning to remind me to bring it in. A copy of it.
Okay.
Otherwise you won't be able to get it.
And we'll send out emails to everyone else in the actual class so you know.
Alright.
The seminar is sort of a strange hybrid of the seminar that we're co-teaching and a lot of other people coming in as well. So we have some management to take care of.
Yeah. Alright, so usually we start by going around and everybody quickly introduces themselves.
I'm Beik. I'm a first year student in translation. I study South Asia, specifically in Dutch and PhD.
I'm Natalie Donnell. I'm a first year PhD student with Professor Collins. I work on women in positions of power in the 16th century.
My name is Lee Stevens. I'm a PhD student working at Professor Collins, working on the relationship between language and violence during French Wars of Religion.
I'm Susan Darrow. I'm a second year master's student, and I'm interested in the intersection of politics and art in Europe.
I'm Brenda Cameron-Steinke. I'm a first year PhD student, and I study medieval environmental history.
I'm Tomasa Civic. I teach early on in Europe here, and I apologize, I probably have to leave about 20 minutes early.
I'm Sayit Kaymakçı, PhD candidate, fifth year here at Georgetown, working with Professor Gabor Agoston on the constitutional limits of military reform in the Ottoman Empire, 17th and 18th centuries.
I'm Jim Shadell, and I specialize in Central Europe, and I'm a member of the department.
I'm Matt Quota. I'm a master's student. I'm studying modern German economics.
Jacob Burnham. I'm a third year PhD student studying French and its empire in early modern South Asia.
Nathan Markowitz. I'm a fifth year PhD student at George Mason University. I study French and Ottoman diplomacy during French Wars of Religion.
I'm Sakhan Khan. I'm a fifth year PhD student. I'm working on tolerance in the 17th century France.
I'm Ashley Corbin, and I'm just finishing up a dissertation on blasphemy during the 16th century.
Elizabeth Cross. I'm on the faculty here, and I teach on the French Empire in the Revolutionary era.
You already know who
Sorry,
And for those of you who don't know, this is Tom Adams. He retired from the National Endowment of Humanities. Here we go.
Okay, well, great. Well, first, I just want to thank Jim Hugley for inviting me to speak to all of you, and I also want to thank everybody here for having read my, well, rather lengthy chapter on the French Wars of Religion, remembering the French Wars of Religion. I appreciate that. So just before we get started talking about it, I'd like to say a few words about how this chapter fits into my book. I'd also just like to say a little bit about how I actually came to write this chapter, because I hadn't actually planned to write it when I first imagined this book project. And then third, just say a few words to situate it within the context of recent works on the memory of the French Wars of Religion, which I imagine will be one of the main things we'll be talking about today, just to get us started. Okay, so as I just mentioned briefly at the beginning of the chapter, this work is actually the last chapter in a much longer project on urban history writing in France, in French provincial cities in the 16th and 17th centuries. And that work I'm provisionally calling Historical Communities, Cities, Erudition, and National Identity in Early Modern France. And so in the book as a whole, I examine the development of local and mostly urban history writing as a genre, approximately in the time period of starting around 1560, although I do have some stuff before that, up to around the 1660s. And I do try to make an argument that that is actually a coherent period. It's a period in which local historians, who are mostly lawyers, judges, clerics, a few others, begin to rely heavily on archival sources to construct their narratives, where they start to develop a community of people who are interested in these issues and consult with each other. They form contacts among each other in these provincial cities, but also with the erudite members of what was beginning to be thought of as the French Republic of Letters. And they were using historical narrative to frame local origins and special privileges within a decentralized provincial legal framework of the French kingdom. So what I'm trying to do is to construct the concerns of what really does become a genre of writing as a whole. And there's been many people who have written on specific urban historians or specific urban histories. They've mostly stuck to one locality. What I'm trying to do is look at the picture overall. Okay, so the book then tries to make three main arguments, I guess. I'll just tell you what they are very briefly. So the first concern of the book is to extend and deepen recent analyses of French urban political culture in this period from the second half of the 16th century through roughly the first half of the 17th century, to deepen analyses of this urban political culture as one that retained a kind of an intellectual and a political vitality, and a deliberate emphasis on civic identity. And of course, this kind of statement goes against much older notions of the growth of absolutist monarchy. I don't even want to mention the word absolutism in this room. But even though, of course, political styles are changing, what a lot of work over the last couple of decades, at any rate, has been showing is just how vital urban politics could still be. And so I'm thinking of works like Michael Green's Law, City and King. I know Michael came to speak to earlier. Jean Lignereau's Lyon et le Roi, for example. I try to do the same kind of thing in my own between Crown and Community. So the idea is that towns retained an active political life, even though sort of previous ideas about culture and urban politics, and in particular Bernard Chevalier's work on the bonne ville of France would suggest that this kind of culture was receding. Okay, so in my view that was not the case at all, and one of the groups that is often blamed for this receding of political life and culture is this group of officiers moyens that has been so focused on by Michel Casson and others who have been working with him. So middling royal officials, right? And the story is that middling royal officials were so caught up in seeking worth and advancement via the royal administration that they became less concerned for upholding local liberties and articulating civic traditions. Now what my work on local history writing shows is really the fundamental investment of these kinds of men in elaborating urban historical traditions. And so not in spite of their interests and training, but largely because of their interests and their particular training. Okay, so these works are mostly written by elites, but at the same time, urban histories relied also on more popular understandings of the local past. And so I'm trying to make an argument that these local histories, even though they are the work of lettered elites, draw on a fund of local memory and historical traditions that are present in a number of ways. They are etched into the very urban fabric, the fortifications and churches and all of those things. They are enacted in daily life, often through things like processions, and they matter and they get factored into these urban histories. So the fact that a larger audience is always sought in these histories, I think, is marked by the fact that they're almost all written in French. Almost none of them are written in Latin. And the goal is to reach a wider audience. But the very fact that these works did draw on expressions of local memory also made them a real site of contestation. Okay? So people disagree about what should be in these works and what various urban traditions meant. And you can see that, of course, in looking at particular things that get put into question. And for example, the memory of the words of religion is one of these obvious sites of contestation. Then another focus of my book is to examine historical practices that underwrote these histories, and especially the ties between authors and the communities of scholars and other social elites with whom they interacted. And so they did this through the use of archives, because as I'm sure we all know, there were no public archives. So access to archives meant that you had to know the people in charge. And so that's one kind of a network or a group of associates that gets formed around these urban histories. But also what we find is that these local men of letters are also getting tied into the larger world of erudite historians, literary scholars, etc., that are more generally thought of as making up the Republic of Letters. So we have these local guys who are in contact with people like the Dupuis brothers, the Saint-Marc brothers, André Duchesne, Peresque, and through these interactions, they share information and methodologies. And so what it means is that local history writing became an integral component of erudite history as it was developing into the 17th century, and as it would later become enshrined in the works of Jean-Marie Millon and the Circle of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. So these urban histories sort of fit into that development of erudite history as it's developing in the 17th century. And then lastly, in my book, I'm also concerned to highlight the fundamental connectedness of local history writing with broader projects to use history as a means to define the French kingdom and national identity as a whole. So my argument is that local expressions of history and local sources are necessary to the people who are formulating a broader notion of French identity, and that both sides are conscious of this need, so that the local is fundamental to the creation of the wider identity. And so I explore this kind of question through several ways. One is by looking at local origin stories contributed to and were shaped by concerns of modern day privileges, early modern day privileges, but then also by focusing on two moments of exchange. And one occurs in the 1570s when François de Belfray was writing the French portions of the Cosmographie Universelle. And to do this, he got buy-in from lots of local cities and towns who sent information to his publishers, and then all of that was then incorporated into his cosmography. And much history writing of the 16th century probably wouldn't have existed or wouldn't have been published without this project. So that's one sort of node of exchange. Another is with André Duchesne in the 1620s and the 1630s. André Duchesne is most known for being a foremost genealogical historian, but he's also someone who is interested in creating a broader notion of French history and using local sources and local information in order to do this. Okay, so those are basically the three main thrusts of the book as a whole. Now, I said at the beginning that when I was first researching and conceptualizing my book, I didn't actually plan to have a chapter on the wars of religion in it. And I had come across the information on Orléans early on in my research, but I was mostly planning to use that as just an example of how contested history writing can be. But then I got invited to join a panel at 16th Century Studies on remembering religious war. It was Andrew Spicer who said, okay, do you have anything to contribute to this? So I said, okay, I'll try. And we did, in fact, put together a panel. Absolutely nobody went or remembers this panel because there was a memorial panel for Sharon Kettering going on at exactly the same time. Yes, I'm sure you were. And so we had a few scattered, I don't know, medievalists and just people, the only people at French Historical Studies who had never heard of Sharon Kettering, I suppose. So that landed flat. But that paper got me thinking about the cases when the wars of religion became a particular object of analysis. When they were left out, and especially when they had a particular personal resonance for the author. So writing about the wars of religion came to interest me as a particular example of the difficulties of writing about the recent past in these urban histories. Because other kinds of historical debates could be fraught, but when people were writing about religion in the 16th and the 17th centuries, they were writing about people, right? People that they knew, right? Either people who were still alive or the immediate ancestors of people who they knew. So they were narrating the roles and especially the mistakes of a large group of people, right, within the city. So it's also here where the highly personal nature of history writing began to emerge for me, where personal and family memory could interact and possibly merge with institutional claims and civic traditions. And so that's how this became a chapter, and indeed the last chapter of my book. I just wanted to say a few words about the literature on the memories of the wars of religion. I don't want to talk too long because obviously I would like to have plenty of time to talk about the paper that you read. But you may certainly have noticed, and especially from the bibliography that I passed around to all of you, that there's been an outpouring in the last 5 to 10 years of studies examining the range of deliberate strategies to influence how the French wars of religion would be remembered and interpreted, both during the wars themselves and afterward. Did everybody get that bibliography, or did you
People in
just?
the seminar.
Okay, so some of you did. You can pass it around for those of you who didn't see it. I just mentioned a few of those people. So some of this work has involved taking a second look at how historical narratives and collections of sources that we've taken for granted for generations were constructed in the first place. Amy Graves Monroe does this with how Simon Boulard collected and structured his well-known compendium of sources on Huguenot experiences during the wars, the Mémoire de l'État de France. Phil Benedict has examined how the collections of prints of the signal events of the wars led to a specifically Protestant interpretation of their course, of how they developed over time. And very recently, Tom Hamilton has re-examined the work of such a well-known figure as Pierre de l'Étoile, demonstrating the dynamic process through which he assembled his many pamphlets and images and commentaries to construct a personalized interpretation of the reign of Henry III and the League, and one that exonerated his own actions, or in fact lack of action, and which was then popularized in the next generation by Pierre Beik. So people have been looking at how we get the views of the wars of religion to begin with. And we see how many of our own conceptions of these wars depend heavily on argumentative works that were constructed carefully at the time. Also, it's becoming increasingly clear that debates about religion and politics by no means subsided with the end of the official wars of religion. Okay, now there's been a lot of debate recently about whether the canonical dates for the end of the wars of religion, 1595 or 1598, whichever you take it, should be taken as definitive. And I know you had a guest earlier who maintains categorically, Brian Sandberg, 1629. I don't want to get into that debate right now, but whether you want to extend the wars of religion to 1629 or not, what is clear is that individuals used several forms of media to mark their loyalties by the beginning of the 17th century. So, for example, David Van der Linden has shown how people collected portraits in portrait galleries to indicate not only the sort of the history of the wars, but essentially where they stood in relation to them, like where they put what portraits and which portraits they chose to collect. So it's a lot about their views of what happened. Phil Benedict and Olivier Christin have emphasized how processions became highly politicized during and after the wars and made very specific statements about the town's history during these events and what that meant. And then also there's been a lot of work done recently on writers who drafted but also revised journals and memoirs after the fact to mark their loyalties to the crown and dominant local elites. So people like Amalou, Wolfgang Kaiser, Michel Casson, they've all talked about how people used these very personalized modes of expression, right, to mark their positions and to reflect on what had happened. And it's also becoming increasingly clear that the arguments of the wars of religion by no means subsided in the 17th century. So Barbara Diefendorf, who I know also came to speak with you, you've definitely had the greats of the period here. Her article, La Montpellier, discusses the destruction and then the rebuilding of churches and temples in Montpellier and how these battles went long into the 17th century. In an article that's not yet published but will be out soon, David van der Linden again talks about the ways that archives became key points of contention in this process of claiming property and right to ownership. That will be coming out in 16th century studies journal, but you can look out for it. And Diane Margolf has talked about the ways that the edict has not itself constructed a whole series of legal suits that sought to refight and redefine hostilities that had taken place during the religious wars. So in multiple venues, right, people are still arguing. And so my work on urban histories fits into this literature, demonstrating that the religious and political questions of the wars of religion were no means over with the end of the 16th century. But one thing my focus adds, I think, is that the debates about the memory and meaning of the wars were not limited to disputes between Protestants and Catholics, as much of this other work tends to talk about, but in fact endured unabated within communities that were overwhelmingly Catholic. So Catholics are still arguing about the Catholic role in the French wars of religion. So we may need to rethink chronological boundaries. And this is not necessarily because the wars of religion should be extended to 1629, but because of the recognition that just because the Edict of Nantes called for forgetfulness, this didn't mean that people actually forgot anything. And I think a lot more work needs to be done on how people did not forget and what that meant in the many communities in France. Okay, thanks everybody. That's what I wanted to say in introduction.
So, well, I'll start off before we do questions for the anecdote showing how the wars of religions lasted for a long time. Marc Bloch talks about how when he was posted to Montpellier during World War II, most of you know who Marc Bloch is, but some may not, a famous French medievalist who was of Jewish heritage, fought in resistance in World War II, he also fought in World War I, and was executed by the Gestapo in Lyon in 1944. But he was posted to Montpellier, and his dean there was an anti-Semite who gave him a hard time, apparently. This was during the war. And Bloch, I think it's in Strange Defeat, but it might be in Histories Craft, talks about the fact that when he first came down there, the dean said to him, well, you know, you have to be a little careful about what you say here. And so Bloch assumed that he was talking about Dreyfus. And he said, well, you know, Dreyfus says, no, you can say whatever you want about Dreyfus, but when you're talking about the wars of religion, you watch what you have to say. So, that's a pretty extreme example of how one has to be careful. If you've ever listened to Janine Garrison talk about the wars of religion, you know that it's still just as true. All right, so we'll open up the floor. Awesome.
I think it's Historian's Craft, by the way. But anyway, because I remember that. I remember that.
I think it's Historian's Craft.
I've never read it on Fitz. I found this fascinating, and I'm an Italianist. I was trying to think of ways this was different in Italy, but I don't know enough about these texts in Italy to have clear ideas on that. But I have a couple of questions on these texts from a kind of material point of view. So I was curious, first of all, if they were more frequent in cities that had printers, if there were if there was anything to do with the printing industry that somehow connects to the production of these texts, or if by 1600 there's a printer in every French town, so that's not a relevant question, I'm not sure. But also related to that, whether they're actually fancy objects or not. Are these the kinds of books? You said the writers are elite, but they're addressing a broader audience. Are these relatively cheap books, or are they fancy and big with illustration? Those kind of questions. And then finally, if any of and you may have said this in the article, in which case I'm sorry if I forgot, but how often they were commissioned by like a city government or anything like that?
I'm sorry, since this is the last chapter, a lot of basic information is obviously
Sure.
not in this chapter. I would say that, so, yeah, by the 17th century, most major towns do have publishers. And many of these texts are published in the town where they're written, although some might be published in the local major publishing center. So some works from Bourgogne might be published at Lyon, some works from, just central France might be published in Paris. But on the whole, they are published locally. In terms of how expensive they are and are they nice, they do vary. Although, so normally first editions would be folios, so relatively expensive. If they become very popular, if they're published then again, they might get down to quarto size. But they do tend to be relatively expensive books. They're not like beautifully printed. They're just kind of basically printed. They don't have multiple illustrations. Some of them do have nice cover pages, maybe with an illustration, but they're not meant to be like gorgeous collectible works. They are meant to be sort of serviceable works. But yeah, probably out of the range of your typical craftsman, I would imagine. Although there's some evidence that at least some of them were more widely available, that even if you didn't own a copy, you might be able to consult a copy. In one travel narrative I have, the author says, go to the, I forget the name of the inn, the Côte d'Or, and consult the history of the city that the innkeeper has there. So they are out and about. Commissioned. Some of them, a few of them are commissioned by city governments, but it's more the case that individuals will decide to write these works and then they will seek some financial patronage from the city government. So most of them are not commissioned, but some of them are underwritten.
I can jump in for a second there. That a lot of ones I've seen are the same, and provincial ones also. The estates of Brittany, for example, d'Argenteuil, Histoire de Bretagne, and then comes to the estates who then give him money. But they don't. When his son comes later for a re-edition, they give him money in advance. But the 16th century ones, I don't know money afterwards.
And that's a slightly unusual case too, because that is such a politicized work.
Particularly the 1582
Yeah,
edition.
yes. So that one is slightly unusual, and it causes a major, a major controversy, and people write against it. So that one's a little unusual, but yes, so in the places that do have provincial estates are also bodies that might contribute to the publication of these
All ones
works.
I know, it's ex post facto. So.
Yeah, just sort of jumping off of Tommaso's point, it sort of seemed to me that the key literature that seemed to really frame this for me was the literature of the history of the book, actually. And I guess sort of on that point, and we talked to Tommaso already about the materiality, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how your book talks about the history of scholarly practice and the history of historical research, because the way that I saw it in this, you give so many different tantalizing moments where scholars are presented with really flawed evidence and have to decide what to do about it, but there doesn't seem to be a systematic treatment of that idea here, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
I guess sort of the whole book is kind of about that. There is no systematic methodology that they're using. It is individuals, in different places, working out what is reliable and what is not reliable at this point. So the way I approach this kind of historical methodology is by looking at cases where we know what's in the archives, and then we know what the authors did with it, essentially. And so that the actual kind of case study that I take is looking at what is in municipal archives, because of my past, right, as an urban historian. So what I try to do is follow how historical narratives get either explicitly or just implicitly constructed in an archival situation, right? Because of course all archives have stories that they're telling, and then how this either influences or constrains people who are trying to present their own view of the history of their locale. But I guess what I think is what is key is the purpose of these works. And so many of these works, you know, they're talking about, you know, the historical significance of their community, but of course it's not just because the past is interesting. It's often factors directly into the prestige and the possible privileges of their community that they're trying to uphold. So the kind of methodological analysis I do is looking at that specifically. How do people construct stories that are sort of satisfying to their community, but also useful, that make very specific points in particular. Mostly elite groups of governors, right, who want to be able to use. Over time, this builds definitely to what I call erudite history, which I think my definition of that is rather broad. By erudite history, I mean a kind of a history that privileges documentary analysis and analysis of what we would call material culture. And that then really gets codified by the late 17th century. And I guess one of the main points I'm trying to make there is that a lot of this local writing is important to the development and then the sustaining of that kind of historical approach. And sort of in the traditional narrative of 17th century history in France, you have the great methodological historians of the 16th century, and then it's kind of all downhill for a while. Horace Branham is one of the people who significantly contributed to that kind of narrative. But in fact, where you see sort of a less sort of methodologically concerned history writing going on mostly in royal history writing, like the big narrative histories of the kingdom, where you see the sort of this development of sort of the use of sources and chronology and material remains that starts really in the 16th century. You see this carried through without any real falling off in more of this sort of local history writing in the 17th century. So those are the kinds of methodological claims I'm trying to make in this work. And then, so some of the way I do that too is by looking at successive historians of a similar area and what they find problematic about the work of previous historians. And then they value what was done before, but they'll say things like, so and so was, just using the cartulary of the cathedral, and didn't consider right, all of these other sources, and believed some of the fables, right, in this legendary when they should have been. They'll say things like that, and so over time you see more of a focus on actually trying to use diplomatics, really, to try to answer a series of questions.
Can you say some of the things to me?
we say similar things today for our like earlier
Certainly.
histories like.
Well, certainly we do. Although we have to acknowledge, though, that they do have a kind of they do have a worldview, and they don't get out of it. You know, so in chapters where I'm looking at how these historians talk about origin stories, they have a view of what the Gallic and the Gallo-Roman past was like, and it's just wrong. Yeah, it's just wrong, and none of their archival skills or none of their their questioning of sources is going to get them out of that view. So I'm not saying that they're suddenly like brilliant, and innovative in every way, but within a certain kind of worldview, they are working toward a more kind of source-based history that does ask questions about verisimilitude and chronology, and starts to understand the concept of just basically social context and things like that we would take for granted today.
So I will just advance into this one. Like also I think the modern historians have worldviews and they are influenced by their worldviews. So it's not just I think our earlier French historians.
Mm-hmm.
But my question is also related to print culture raised by semester. So like how many editions these books had and how many changes like that were made during these editions? Because you mentioned at one point they took out of some of the things that didn't look ancient or I don't know. So they updated it. They brought more ancient material so that it's more legitimate, and they took out others. And that was like a case like where they just wanted to just destroy all the copies available. So maybe it was a manuscript or something. I don't know if you can destroy all the copies in the sprint.
Only in very rare cases would copies be destroyed.
Because
I mentioned one family though that tried to destroy the.
Yes.
I think that's what he's talking about.
Oh, right. Well, this is Sheldon Bouleville, right? Where his family did try to destroy the copies of his book, but as I say in the chapter, we don't really know why, unless you have new evidence.
Oh, I saw
Yes, we don't really know why. Yes.
But also, I work on the autonomous and we don't have this with cultures. Obviously, manuscripts are like just open books, like open notebooks. So each reproduction is just a new book because the producer has an intent and like a political context and aim and just adds material. But like it's very similar in the way that you mentioned how they copy earlier books. That's why I think like just everything. So do you show like how these things work? Like how these different sources interpolate, like what they copy from earlier sources in what way, and like how did it matter, or like the new editions, so kind of this kind of open notebook, not like a manuscript era, but just in the print era, how much like there was an open space for you to play with the history and also maybe it seems that you don't look at 18th century, but maybe these books were copied in the 18th century. You might see like a contribution of these efforts, like so because then it tells something about the history of that history. So that's like what I'm trying to do in my dissertation, just how they were copied and the different treatises were kind of interconnected. So I think I started like to work on like a single century, but then my advisor said, but earlier you had this, and earlier you had this. Right. To 100 years. Yes. So I'm just asking you how this.
Yeah. It's rare for there to be multiple editions of these works. So for that's why the case of Orléans, that's why I found it so interesting, and that there were two basic editions, and there were real changes from one edition to another. Mostly you get a generation or two later, you get someone new publishing a new history where they may very well use some of the information from an older history. Really, one exception to that is on the history of Paris, which is not actually I don't actually talk about the history of Paris in this book, but we did publish an article on the history of Paris in the 16th century on this guy, François de Belfort, where you do see multiple editions of a kind of a history of Paris, where there is a lot of adding and essentially multiple authors. But where you do get a lot of copying and reuse is in manuscripts. It would be very common for histories that are not sort of technically urban histories, but these kinds of memoirs or sort of chronicles, life writing, that kind of thing that was presumably meant for the family, but that would then essentially get out into more of the public sphere of the community and be copied multiple times. So that did, and used. So that did happen, and in some cases those manuscripts are no longer extant, but you can see information from them that gets incorporated into works that actually were published. So yes, there is this kind of a circulation of useful manuscripts, and occasionally you see changes over several editions, but mostly with these urban histories, there's one edition and there's kind of one statement, and then it just gets kind of updated maybe a generation or two later. Although in some cases they think, okay, well, we now have this urban history, so sort of our town's covered. We don't need any more. Although in the 18th century there is then a movement to write better, more detailed, more archival histories that are kind of a whole new ballgame in terms of the amount of sources used and frankly the length. That kind of helps me periodize this. That those really are noticeably more kind of involved than these ones in the 16th and 17th centuries. But that sounds great what you're doing.
Yeah, also those 18th century ones often publish a lot of documents, rather than
Right.
Hickman's will do that with the
Right, oh, yes.
And so you get
Yes.
not only the history, but
Yes.
then these are the documents that I based it on.
Right, and you get some of that with these two. Either kind of interpolated in the text or by the 17th century, sometimes you also get a volume of documents. So it's a practice that's being generalized, especially in the 17th century.
Jim, was it somebody down there had a question? Jim should know.
Yeah.
We'll get back to Ashley.
And you point out that authors had to be careful about offending either side, Catholic or Protestant, but you also mentioned that they had to watch out for the crown, that they could also offend the crown. And so I'm wondering if there are, in fact, cases where the crown took retribution on any of these authors for having spoken out of turn, since the crown was advocating reconciliation, and so if you go beyond that, you could get in trouble. So do we have cases where they got in trouble?
Well,
Thou shalt play. It's a poster child.
Is he the one and only, or?
I can't think of any others because these people really self-edited.
Well, I would add one. I would add
Oh,
one
you
to
have
that in
another
the
one?
sense. It's a slightly different case, but the second volume of Jacques de Thou
Oh, right, okay.
was
yeah.
put on the
That's true.
index in Rome,
Yes.
pushed by Bellarmine, and then about a year or two later, Bellarmine's book was burned by the Parliament of Paris, led by Jacques de Thou. So the two of them engaged in a sort of mutual censorship, if you want to call it that, between 1606 and 1610. Not quite the same thing. The case in Brittany is about the relationship between the crown and the dukes of Brittany, and especially the documents at the end of the 15th century. And D'Argentré presents a, shall we say, very Breton interpretation of things.
Yes.
And the crown was not amused.
Yeah. Most of these works have a royal privilege. So, yeah, I kind of don't know of any that were sort of published on the sly. I mean, some of them you might think would not be particularly, that would be somewhat problematic. So there's a work published on Bordeaux in the late 16th century, which draws heavily on a manuscript book of privileges that from the Middle Ages, though, which dates from the time when the English kings were the Dukes of Guienne, and it just sort of imports in all of the positive representation of the English, and you would think that that might be a problem. But in fact, so then that work is updated by somebody in the early 17th century, and he has a very sort of pro-Henry IV stance, and that kind of seems to take care of it, even though that earlier work is published as is repeatedly, but no one seems to be concerned about that. There are some works, some of these works, and this is in a completely different chapter, they use the past, especially the past of ancient Gaul, to imagine sort of different political organizations, conceptions. And some of them are implicit, well, they're never anti-monarchical, but they are pro-aristocratic. And some of these were, so they tend to be written in that sort of first generation after the wars of religion, sort of the 1610s, 1620s. One in particular was not until, interestingly, 1660, and I've just never quite understood how a work that really is implicitly saying that aristocracy is better, how that could be published in 1660 and no one would mind. It just doesn't seem to be an issue. I mean, I don't know, maybe people weren't reading these works as carefully as I've been reading them. Because if they were, I would think that that would be a problem. Of course, the author was long dead by that point, so I don't know. So there could be some critical aspects to some of these works, but no, I don't really see very much pushback on the part of the Crown.
But you have quite a bit actually on Lubice, and
Yes.
Lubice trying to protect himself from his past, which was that had gotten you would think would have gotten him in a lot more trouble than it did. He got him enough as it was,
Well,
but he clearly seems to be saying things that he's worried that.
Well,
I sort of wanted.
Well, he was banished. He was banished from
know.
Lyon, his office was taken away from him.
Right.
I mean, this work is essentially his legal brief to get his job back, right? And so he is, but so he's presenting he's presenting a heavily contrite and very sort of pro royal authority position. By this time.
To some degree, but I mean, he also attacks Paradin at length.
Yes.
And the book sometimes reads like him contradicting Paradin.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I thought it's been very interesting, this whole controversy that started about 10 years ago about Louise Labbé, where Lubice is implying she was a courtesan and didn't write.
Right.
She's tied in with Paradin's faction, really, if you go back to the 1550s. So is he really attacking her as a way to get at the political faction that he had opposed earlier in the century? I mean, what did you see? I know you took out a section of Lubice.
It was just a very short.
But I was curious, because there we have an earlier text that was published, I think, in 1573. And we have him, in many of those passages, he's taking a line that I wouldn't think Henry IV would be particularly happy with. And certainly some of the people in Lyon, somebody like Bellièvre, who was closely tied into the Lange and that whole faction. How do you see that his relationship with something like that?
He is obviously very critical of
Yes.
that, right? Yes.
He calls him an idiot, and he talks about how he believes all these fairy tales.
Right. Yes. And I think that their rivalry definitely goes back to the 1570s. So Lubice's other work, not his long, Histoire de Lyon of 1604, but his earlier work on the privileges, whatever else, of Lyon, which is also heavily historical, was published just shortly after Paradin's work, if I remember correctly, and it does seem to be a kind of a rejoinder
Yeah.
there.
And he also writes on the customary law of Burgundy at the invitation of Nicolas de Beaufort, who's a relative of his, right? And he has a whole lot of historical stuff in there about Beaufort, never mind about the
Right.
And he actually says in the beginning of that, well, you might ask why someone from a pays de droit écrit is being asked to write the customary law of a pays coutumier, right? So he's clearly aware that he's rather an odd person to be writing the customary law of Burgundy. So and a lot of that is very political, to put it mildly. And I've always read the history of Lyon as a kind of, a lot of it, local people would have read it in a very different way than somebody reading it for the broad history of a French major city.
Yes, and I think that's an important point always to keep in mind, that local and contemporary readers would hear all the dog whistles. Whereas we have to work very hard to figure out what they might have been.
Yeah, I'm sure I missed plenty of
Yes.
So I had a question about the idea of objectivity, which you touched upon. But I was especially struck by Claude Bondeau and his work at negating kind of the traditional ideas of this event that happened and kind of citing, well, in his contemporaries, citing the Protestant rendition of that event and how he was concerned with the event as it happened. And is this kind of a foreshadowing of Ronca, or is this in his own time, or was this a concept that people were interested in, this objectivity of what's events as they actually happen, or is he kind of
I'm still thinking about Le Mans. Okay, I think the short answer to that is no. There's a real debate going on in Le Mans about religious authority, the status of miracles, and there are clearly factions in Le Mans that want to take a very different view, sort of more of a, well, what earlier would have been sort of a politique stance versus people who really want to adhere to the idea of religious tradition as it is established and rooted in the past. And so, frankly, I am not exactly sure exactly what set Bondeau off, but he is somebody. He is a Catholic who decided to write a collection of portraits of illustrious men, which, okay, that was a common genre, but also Theodore de Beze did in fact write one of those, right? And then of the first three guys he did, two of them were Protestants, which says something. And so this is a sort of an ongoing, this question of this miracle that supposedly occurred, this is sort of an ongoing event in Le Mans because it is celebrated in the procession of the translation of this saint's relics. And it is clearly something that is politicized, and we're in the middle of the 1660s here, and I mean, my hunch is that it's related to questions about how do you treat Protestants in the decades leading up to the Revocation. I don't have any sort of firm evidence for that, but there's clearly sort of a kind of a community of skeptics or of sort of philosophical free thinkers in Le Mans. I mean, it's interesting that this is a provincial town, and yet there's clearly this kind of group in this city of which he is a part. And so, no, I wouldn't say it has really anything to do with it.
It's a class issue too, because you talk about the credulous people who are superstitious to believe in these things.
Yes, so he's a lawyer, and he would actually, he ended his life actually by being killed by in a tax revolt. So he sided with the concept of sort of collecting royal taxes in the city that most of the population was absolutely against. Now, that was in the future, but he is somebody who, at that point that he's writing this as a lawyer, he would become a royal commissioner and a member of the city council later on. So yeah, it is possible that he does, in fact, have a negative view of, of these credulous people of Le Mans. Clearly a kind of a frustration that this historical, fact is enacted and celebrated every year when, he takes a very particular position too on, do miracles occur right now that we are not in the time of the early church? And like many, Protestants and Catholics, his argument is, no, right? Of course, miracles are extremely rare, and so his emphasis on, the concept of God's providence is obviously something that he finds more satisfactory. So he definitely, you're absolutely right, and the bit about him that I have in here is mostly about the question of, both sides were wrong and we have to, but in fact there's actually there's a lot more going on in that city that appears in this chapter. So there was more in this chapter, but I took it out because there was too much, and it's going to be a separate article.
Yeah, it felt like there was a lot.
Yes. So
cool.
So I'm so interested in Willy's book. So because it's his book is throwing out the very volatile issue of interpretation of the violence past in the 16th century. So one thing is that it's the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre.
Yes.
So how do we interpret the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre? And the second one is how do we interpret the Catholic League? So it's
yes.
Yeah, so it's really is said that it's the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre is there is a little bit divine providence, but it's it would not occur in a later period. Yeah, but I thought that it's later on is his name is Symphorian Guillaume. Symphorian Guillaume is said that it's maybe I'm really confused that Symphorian Guillaume and Hector the Precieux, yeah. So it's that Precieux maybe said that it's you're wrong because it's the maybe extreme problem is need extreme remedies.
Yes.
So yeah, so it's he said that it's justified the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre, and then it's another thing is Catholic League that is the really said that it's I was a little bit misguided, so it's their cause is totally wrong, but it's the other writer is said that it's no, it's maybe François Guillaume, maybe I don't know. Sorry. Yeah. So Guillaume said that it's no, it's their religious spirituality is not wrong. Was not wrong. Is the problem is their political motivation.
Yeah.
So I think that it's interpretation is a little bit conflicting that. So which of interpretation is a little bit more appealing to the French people or the local people?
Well, I think my point is that there is no one interpretation, right? People still have diametrically opposed views. And so I think Rubis is a little special because he's in this position of saying, I'm sorry for everything I did during the wars of religion. I was wrong, but nevertheless, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, wasn't wrong, right? So, so he's kind of in this very bizarre situation where he has to say, okay, I was wrong to encourage it, nevertheless it happened and it was a work of God and we shouldn't question a work of God, right? Yeah, okay. So Guillaume is somebody, though, we should note his writing decades later, right, in the 1640s. And, so he's a cleric, right? So he's a very different situation. But he clearly feels that, he is still taking the ardent Catholic position, about the wars of religion that was, dominant during the time, right? And, he is not stepping back from that. He's interpreting the wars in very much the same way that an ultra-Catholic would, in the 1580s. And it's interesting to see that he is saying these things, right? In writing. Again, no one is pushing back against him, which is also interesting, right? But he's very much in dialogue with somebody who takes a very different view, and François Lemaire is another one of these guys, like Claude Blondeau, right, who clearly feels that mistakes were made during the religious wars, and he feels, okay, we're past that now, right? We can talk about it, but maybe we can talk about it because it's over, I think is his view, right? Whereas other people think, no, it's most definitely not over. This is, the same religious fight that we've had, right? And Catholics can still learn from, can learn lessons from, the people who died during the wars, and the Catholics who died were true martyrs for the faith, and this kind of discussion is still going on in the 1640s. It's not supposed to be, right? With the Edict of Nantes, you're not supposed to remember this stuff, and yet everyone is still remembering it, and still is even publishing about it. And then, so this guy, Dave Frisch, he reads the work, and it antagonizes him so much that he actually sits out and he writes his own manuscript rejoinder, right? Because he wants his view to be memorialized in some way. So that, I think that's to me the interesting part of this. People are still intensely disagreeing, and some people really are adhering, just will not, give up the kind of religious attitudes that were, at the roots, of these hostilities in the 16th century, and people still feel that way, even into the middle of the 17th century.
I want to come back to Rubis for a second, because Rubis also, one of the things that Rubis is a good example of is if you have a person like him who key figures, and in this case it would be Pompon de Béliard, who's Chancellor of France, of course is more or less in charge of censorship, technically speaking, is related to Rubis. Because Rubis' aunt, Françoise, is the wife of Claude Pateran. Pateran's sister is Béliard's grandmother, right? And Béliard, of course, is from Lyon. Rubis drives their mutual cousin Nicolas de Lange out of the city in 1588 after the murder of the Guise brothers. Rubis is then driven out of the city. Lange comes back and organizes the royal entry of Henry IV into Lyon following this. So when something like Rubis is being published, and Rubis is communicating back and forth with somebody like Béliard, I mean, this is a guy who, they're relative, they know each other. Béliard doesn't have to be told about what happened at Lyon. He knows intimately, and he knows that Delange and Rubis have been struggling with each other, and Paradin and everybody else, going back at least to the 1550s. So that he's an unusual case in that at the highest level of the kingdom, you've got somebody who's actually literally part of his personal circle, who would know the intimate details like this the way that in most of these other people, I don't think anybody in Henry's inner circle is going to know anybody as well as Béliard would know Rubis and their mutual family. So in that sense, he's a somewhat unusual character.
Now I do have a question that relates to Italy. You mentioned origins as a big part of these works. Now in the Italian case, there's always this attempt to choose your origins, and of course Roman is good enough, but if you go Greek or Trojan, that's even better. What is the best kind of origin you want for your town? Is it Roman or Gallic or what?
That changes over time. So Roman is really good maybe in the 15th century. By the early 16th century, it's definitely Trojan, because the Trojans are, of course, older than the Romans. By the second half of the 16th century, it's the ancient Gauls. So you want local origins, and so almost all of these texts talk about the local Gallic peoples, and and you sort of have them as, you know, a kind of a beginning to the local tradition. The way they do this, though, they often can't really quite give up the notion of an actual founder of the city. That can be a problem. And when that happens, so a lot of people, a lot of these historians rely on the sort of the fabled kings of Gaul, you know, that were created by Agnes de Viterbo. And so this text is sort of received and given credit in France quite a lot later than actually in many other places. And it's actually, many editions come out in the 16th century and even into the late 16th century. So you see people who are, you know, trying to develop a historical sense in many other areas, but still kind of get tied to this idea that, you know, that there's a particular person, right, who just happens to have a name that's very similar to the town's name and founded the town, right? But what happens is that this person is no longer a Roman emperor or, you know, a Trojan prince, but now this person is some, you know, king or prince of a Gallic tribe. And what you get is a lot of arguments about which tribe founded which town, and especially the ones that are mentioned by Caesar. You know, so Caesar mentions some Gallic community, right? And so which French town is this? And you get a lot of arguments about this you know, back and forth over, you know, which town can claim this particular honor. And this is where I mentioned that you get a lot of confusion about early history because a lot of historians in the 16th and the 17th century really want to credit the ancient Gauls with all of the, well, just the architecture and the remains that are from the Gallo-Roman period, because they want these to be Gallic. They do not want these to be from the period of, you know, Roman domination. So the Romans really are, they tend to be seen as, you know, as invaders, right? Essentially invaders and people who held Gaul illegitimately for centuries. And then this gets tied in with a notion of early French history, where many people at this time will say that the Franks were not Germans, they were Gauls, who went east for a while and conquered, you know, everywhere, including Rome, of course, but, you know, Hungary and all of Italy and, you know, and Germany and everywhere, and then they came back. So, of course, the Gauls and the Franks really are the same people, right? Because the French really have been on French soil, you know, since the beginning of time.
How would you tie all this, because a lot of these people do these rulers, how does this tie, maybe you do this on with the Mos Gallicus and their whole development of French law in French history? A lot of these are the same people doing this. Many of them are trained by Cuyas.
Yes.
How do you tie those things?
Well, they try to use this historically, although I'm not sure I would say that this has anything to do with the Mos Gallicus, but they try to use these kinds of historical narratives essentially to argue for the fundamental authority of local government. So the king gives various towns privileges, but municipal institutions long predated the kings of France. And so it's part of this argument about kind of the essential nature of the political community, that yes, it is authorized by the crown, but it also exists independently of the crown. And so I think this is the way that a lot of these lawyers are using are using this. And it ties in with what I said previously about this, in some cases, authors would go even further and make an argument for aristocracy as being more fundamental to the French kingdom than monarchy. So that is one of the ways that it ties in with French law. I guess a natural connection could be made to the importance of customary law.
Particularly since it's being redacted and printed everywhere,
Yes.
right around the same
Right.
time.
And
But very large assembly, some of those assemblies have 1,000 people.
Yes, and then often, as I'm sure works of customary law often have little historical introductions to them, right? So there is an obvious connection being made there.
Tom, it's all right.
Also, there's a hand over here.
I was
I'm sorry, I couldn't see
It's okay.
you.
It was just following up on what it was before, just a little
Yeah.
bit. I mean, I'm always fascinated with Charlemagne, and so you answered it to a certain degree. And I studied German history and looking at chronicles that they always go back to Charlemagne. In both countries,
Yes.
Karl the Grosse versus Charlemagne,
Right.
and the French never seem to acknowledge that there's any German connection. And surprise,
There was a
surprise.
German connection.
Yes, exactly. But this also is the point that we know him as Charlemagne, and so so why does Charlemagne win? And does it have anything to do with your historians? Or how is it that when I say to my students Karl the Grosse, they're like, what? And so they have absolutely no idea who he is. And so you sort of answered a little bit, but I was just pressing a little bit more like, how does that get erased so easily that he's German? And so
Yeah. I don't know whether I have anything specific to say about that. In the works of my guys are actually often debunking the idea that this institution or that institution was founded by Charlemagne.
Right. So that's
Yeah.
by the
Yeah. So that's more where
that's
he
more
pops
what's
up,
happening.
rather than I suspect that Francicization of Charlemagne or solely is probably going on in other kinds of works. And actually, I would imagine that would be more in the kinds of the sort of the royal histories than in these local works.
And you can show your students, there's a wonderful website, Regnum Frantorum, right? And one of the things that they have, it's maps, digitalized maps, and they have all kinds of different things. And one of the things that you can do on that is, one of the maps you can get is a map of a little dot of every mention of Charlemagne, and where it is in the kingdom, right? And I think there's one dot in Paris, right? And of course you can imagine where all the dots are, and they're not around Paris. So it's a perfect map to show your students exactly what you're trying to prove. The top.
Well, I was really impressed with how the historians were really anxious not to inflame passions, and it seemed that was also connected with the idea of being good subjects, that was what was appropriate to do. And it seemed that, and I was wondering whether being an urban historian among your group sort of incurred or reflected a politique attitude and outlook, or whether they actually were very partisan. But the one statement that really jumped out at me was the mayor saying that we learned, I think, that we cannot force consciences.
Right, yes.
And I thought, was that an attitude, or was that his attitude, or was it shared at all?
Well, I mean, okay, that's the fundamental underlying attitude of the Edict of Nantes, right? That's the official line, right? And it is interesting to see him saying that. So for Catholics who are, they're kind of happy with the new status quo, I think, that would be the position that they would take, right? That Protestantism is legal, but only under certain conditions. Ultimately, we want everyone to convert, but we can't do it through force, right? And so he is another one of these, local judges. And I think it's the kind of position that we would actually expect, I think, most of these people to take. But in fact, what we see is that they didn't all take that position, right? Some of them. Well, yes. He's an earlier generation, of course, right? Yes. So yeah, but it's interesting to see Romain saying this in such a way and sort of expecting everyone to just kind of like nod along with it, right? But in fact, people didn't nod along with it. You know, other people sort of profoundly disagreed with that position.
The wording is the same wording that Henry IV personally used in a public saying, I think it's in front of the Parliament of Paris, but it relating to the Edict of Nantes, which of course he had difficulty getting registered in lots of places in Normandy not until 1609. But there's the wording is exactly what Henry saw, which I thought was fascinating. You know, just to see that the phraseology was exactly the same. So, scissioniste out there, ready to ask a question?
Yeah. I was curious if you see any financial or material motivations in these Catholic historians who are recording detailed descriptions of the sacred spaces destroyed by Protestant iconoclasts, if there's an expectation they might somehow be able to recoup those costs or appealing to wealthy patrons. And I know you touched on the importance of preserving it from a local cultural perspective, but is there any material or financial aspect?
That's an interesting question. I don't think I can answer that from within these works. No one says, "Oh, look at these horrible ruins, so let's raise some money to fix it." No one says that, but that might be an implicit message going on. That okay, decades after the wars, we still have all these religious institutions in shambles, and we need to get them all fixed and resacralized. I mean, that could be an implication, but I don't see anyone actually saying that. And unfortunately, I don't have enough information about what these people did in their spare time to know whether they were out there, trying to recruit donations to actually rebuild these sites. I mean, it's clearly a concern of these authors, but what they actually did about it or what they hoped might be the result is, it's all something we can speculate about at this point.
So you mentioned like absolutism, but you talk about absolute monarchy and how everybody
She made like this, she's just not willing to admit it. No wine for you.
So I don't know because I can remind you. So yeah, but you show how they are keen to show their obedience to the absolute monarchy, and like everybody was writing it, they just wanted to show like even if they made a mistake in the past, they no longer just follow that line of thought. And so like how much? But you see, so could you see a new sense of like kind of absolute something, like strong king, royal authority? Everybody's just trying to get under it.
I think there's a new political style. What that actually means in daily practice is another matter.
Yeah, but just
but I think there's there's a new way to talk.
Okay.
Can I jump in on this one for a second? Because this is what the key thing in my book is about.
Yeah.
Right? In the dialogue between city governments and the monarchy, there's a dramatic shift in the nature of their vocabulary, late 1590s, early 1690s. So, for instance, traditional vocabulary, the dem public, the chose publique, disappears. It's now the bien de l'État, right? And it's the bien du public, not bien public, which is not the same thing. But at the local level, exactly as you're saying, when we're discussing local matters, like a local election, the old vocabulary, or the sort of Commonwealth vocabulary, if you want to call it that, persists with respect to local matters. But obviously, if you're negotiating with a king, particularly Henry IV did not like these phrases because they were closely tied to the Catholic League. What kind of idiot, when they want something for the king, ask him in language that's going to piss him off? I mean, nobody's that dumb, or maybe a few people. But most people are not that stupid, and so there's a real, I find at this point, and the political discourse, for instance, at the States General 1614, or at the Assembly of Notables 1617, 1626, this is the transitional moment in the political society when they shift to away from this old vocabulary. in 1626 at the Assembly of Notables, the only person who uses the phrase bien de la chose publique is Richelieu. He uses it once, and he was trained at the Collège de Navarre, which is sort of the epicenter of Commonwealth vocabulary. Before we end, since we're on our last couple of minutes here, I did want to read from footnote number 5 to remind you all of something we learned in the fall. This is, Blondeau used only initials to refer to some of these individuals. However, since the copy of the work at the Musée historique de la Réformation in Geneva, RL78, contains manuscript marginalia noting their full names, it is doubtful that contemporary reading in our diagram. You may recall that one of our fall speakers said the first rule of archival stuff is follow the marginalia.